Great. So thank you. First of all, let me say that we've spent 30 years trying to understand how big organizations can outcompete small organizations. And we've had the privilege around the world of working with and studying different organizations. And I want to thank both Bosch and Siemens. They're doing a great job of this. We've learned a lot from them, so thank you for doing this. Okay. So Uwe and Karina set up this issue of culture. And we can talk about innovation theater, but we can also talk about culture change theater. You know, there have been a number of studies done, Deloitte surveys executives around the importance of culture. And in a survey that they did, 94% believed that culture was important. PwC did a survey of executives, and 96 believe that, if they change their culture, they would do better. But here's the problem. There's also evidence that most culture changes are not successful. And that's been my experience as well. And I have some thoughts and maybe some insights that I hope will be useful to you about why culture change efforts are less successful than what they should be. So here's what I propose to do in 30 minutes. So I've been doing this for 30 years. I've got 30 minutes, so I'm going to do 1 year a minute for the next 30 minutes. I want to define culture, and here's why. When I talk to executives about culture, they all agree that culture is important, but when you press them, they don't really understand what culture is, and more importantly, they don't think about it in a way that you can actually manage. So I want to give you a way of thinking about culture that you can actually manage. And then I want to sort of give you a little logic for why you ought to worry about it. You shouldn't worry about it because some academic or some consultant says it's important. I want to show you why culture is absolutely critical for executing strategy, especially in a world of explore and exploit. And then I want to define and explore culture and show you how it's different from an exploit culture. And finally, I want to give you some thoughts about how you might actually change and manage culture. And we're fortunate, we've got Jason with us from Microsoft. I spent the last 12 months trying to understand this remarkable transformation that Microsoft has done in their culture over the last 4 or 5 years under Nadella and Kathleen Hogan. And I want to give you a little taste of how they've done that, because it's a beautiful example about what it takes to change culture. So, culture can be a competitive advantage. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. We see companies that leverage culture for their advantage. The problem is, of course, culture can also be a competitive disadvantage. Ben Horowitz is the managing partner of Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the premier venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. And what Ben says, I agree with. There are lots of bankrupt companies that had great culture. That is, the culture made them successful, but in a world of change, that same culture caused them to actually fail. It stopped them from being innovative. Ben has gone on to write he's a big believer in this. He's gone on to write a second book. I agree with what he says in the second book. That is, unless we are clear about what the culture is that we have and what the culture is that we need, then we'll never be able to manage culture. So let me put culture in the context of strategy. Strategy basically answers 2 questions. It's pretty simple, really. It takes us a long time to teach it, but fundamentally it's pretty simple. We have a corporate strategy that says, what business are we in? This is the portfolio question. And then we have a business strategy question that says, given that we're in a business, why should any customer prefer our product or service to anybody else? And if you think about business strategy, there are really 5 questions that you should be able to answer. And let me tell you why I think it's important that you be able to answer these. If you agree with me that execution of strategy is really about organizational alignment, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how this works. Unless we're clear about what our strategy is, we don't know how to align the organization. So we've got to be, first of all, we have to be clear about our strategy. So here are the 5 questions that IBM uses to decide what the strategy is. The first question, pretty straightforward: who are our customers? Who are we going to serve? Who are we not going to serve? You can't decide what the value proposition is until you know who your customers are, because different customer sets have different value propositions. So we define who our customers are, then we decide why they should purchase our product or service to anybody else. This is the differentiation question. And it could be cost or quality or innovation, or there are lots of reasons. Once we've decided that, we can now be more analytical about it, and we can say, where in the value chain do we make money? What do our economics look like? What are our competitors? We can do the kind of analysis. Once we've done that, we can now make an informed choice about how much we should do and how much we can rely on our ecosystem. And the last question that we have to answer around business strategy is, if we implement this, we know the competition's going to react. So what can we do right at the beginning to protect our revenue stream? All right. So we've answered the strategy question. Now we can think about, well, how do we execute that strategy? And there's 40 years of research on this, so I think we know pretty well what the answer to that question is. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our strategy and we're going to decide what are our key success factors, our KPIs, our OKRs, I don't care what you call it. We take strategy into a set of measurable objectives, and then we align the organization against that. And it takes us 10 weeks to teach this course in our MBA programs, but basically it's pretty simple. Do we have the right people? Are they motivated? We can talk about theories of motivation, but do I have the right people and are they motivated? And then when we teach the course, we spend 4 weeks talking about, are we organized the right way? Are we measuring the right things? Are we promoting people for the right things? And again, we talk about theories of organization, but it's pretty straightforward. And then finally, what we do is we spend a couple of weeks talking about, do people share a set of expectations about how to behave to execute the strategy, the culture? Now, there are a bunch of these models out there. Many of you are familiar with them. The McKinsey 7S, the Galbraith Star, there are a bunch of them. I don't care what model you use. I care a lot about this fit leads to performance. Think about the following. We have a strategy, we know what our key success factors are, but we don't have the right people, or they're not motivated, or we're not measuring the right things, or we're not rewarding the right things, or people don't share a culture that enables us to execute. Fit leads to performance, and culture is a critical part of this that gets left out. Because when senior managers think about culture, they often say, yeah, it's important, but by the way, Monday morning, I've got lots more important things to do. Let me use a great German company as an example. So in 2008, I had a chance to spend some time with SAP. And at the time, Henning Kagermann, co-CEO at the time, realized that the global market for their big ERP systems, these big $20, $30 million systems, was flat and going to decline over the next decade. And so reasonably enough, SAP decided that what they would do is they would move into a growth market. And this was the small and medium-sized business market. But they weren't going to sell big ERP systems. They were going to sell a sort of software as a service. And they had a product called Business by Design, and they believed that if they executed this strategy, they would generate about $1 billion in revenue in the next 3 years. 2 years later, Leo Apotheker, then the co-CEO, they're failing, and he stands up and he gives this speech to the company. And he says, you know what? The culture's killing us. The culture that helps us in our exploit business is stopping us from selling software as a service. And he was even clear about what the culture needed to be if they were going to succeed. Why? They failed, basically. At the moment. They've succeeded since then, but they failed at the moment. And here's why. They tried to do this new innovation with a cross-functional team deep in the organization. That is, they didn't separate the organization out. And if you think about the alignment that it takes to compete in an exploit business, their big ERP business, it's a different set of capabilities. People are motivated differently. You need to measure different things. And critically, the culture needed in a big exploit organization is different than that's needed in a explore organization. And they tried to do it within their big exploit organization. Okay? All right, so now let's step back. Why then do we see these failures? Alignment's important, culture's important. Why do we see these failures? It's pretty simple, actually. Fit leads to success. There's 35 years of research showing that alignment, assuming you have the right strategy, alignment of the organization leads to success. When we're successful, two things happen. Customers like it, we get bigger. When we get bigger, we put in systems and processes. Not because we like bureaucracy, but because the only way we can run a big organization is we put in control systems, budgeting systems, performance management systems, product development. We put in all sorts of systems. It's not wrong. It helps us be successful. Okay? The problem is that develops inertia. It gets harder and harder to change these things. Separate from size, when we're successful as a business and organization, we develop cultures. Even if we're not aware of it, we develop cultures that support our success. Now we have a problem. Because the very things that are making us successful, the fit leads to performance, the performance leads to inertia. It leads to inertia in our systems and processes and metrics. It leads to inertia in our capabilities and our culture. And if we're not careful, it leads to inertia in how we as leaders think about the organization. Does that make sense to you? That's the logic of what's going on, all right? So what's the solution to this? Well, you know, Karina and Uwe sort of gave us at least a part answer to this. We've got to separate these businesses out. That is, the culture that makes you successful in a mature business, it's about compliance, incremental improvement, efficiency, driving costs out. But that's completely different what's required in an explore business, where it's all about trying things, moving fast, failing, that sort of thing. So that's, when we talk about ambidexterity, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about playing two games at the same time. Leveraging assets and capabilities from our existing businesses, maybe adding some new capabilities, and then moving into new businesses. And that takes three separate disciplines. And if you only have one or two of these, you probably will not succeed. And the three disciplines, which I think you all understand pretty well, I know Siemens and Bosch understand it perfectly. You have to have a disciplined process to come up with new ideas. And we've got that. Design thinking, open source innovation, sort of corporate, we can get lots of ideas. That's not enough. Then we have to have a disciplined process to actually decide which of these ideas are customers willing to pay for, this process of incubation. Again, we've got great disciplines for this. Lean startup, business model canvas, you know, people know how to do this. That is not enough either, because then what we have to do is figure out how do we get the assets and capabilities necessary to grow these businesses. And in our experience, Andy and my experience, this is where these innovations typically fail. Most organizations today are willing to spend some money on doing ideation and incubation. The real issue is when we have to start to take assets and capabilities from our existing businesses and giving them to these new businesses. Okay, so let's define culture, okay? Here's what I think culture is. You can disagree with me. For me, culture is a social control system in organizations. Now, we're perfectly okay with designing these formal control systems, but think about it. Somebody comes into your organization, a new employee comes into your organization. It's very important that they fit in. Their future success depends on their ability to kind of fit in the organization. And they're going to figure out how they need to behave. They're going to listen to their leaders. They're going to watch what their leaders do. They're going to sort of look who's getting promoted, who's not getting promoted. They're going to talk to their colleagues. And if I come to work in your organization as a new employee, and I talk to my colleagues and they say, O'Reilly, you want to succeed around here? You got to do A, B, and C. And by the way, you should never do D, E, and F. If I hear that from a bunch of people, that's a control system. And I have a choice. I can do A, B, and C, and I can fit in, or I can do D, E, F, and probably be excluded. Okay? And now the question for you as a leader is that control system, that social control system, is it lined up with your strategy? Is it lined up with your exploit business? Is it lined up with your explore business? So think about culture not as values. You know, when I talk to senior leaders about culture, they typically talk about values. Values are hot air. Now, it turns out they can be useful, but think about it. You can't manage values. You can say we value teamwork or collaboration, or we value integrity, or we value accountability, but until you drive it into a set of behaviors, you can't manage it. So think about culture not as values, but as the pattern of behavior that's reinforced by people, bosses, colleagues, and systems, how we select people, how we train people, how we promote people. We know how to manage patterns of behavior. And if you think about culture as a pattern of behavior, we can manage it. You know, I've had the privilege, actually, of working with General Motors for the last 7 years. And Mary Barra, who is the CEO of General Motors, came into General Motors. She was brought in because General Motors had a big culture problem. They'd had an ignition switch problem. The company knew about it. They didn't do anything about it. Unfortunately, a large number of people were killed. And she was brought in to change the culture. She hates the word culture. What she thinks about is behavior. And what she has done over the last 6 years is she has identified 7 behaviors, and she's driven those behaviors into the organization. And we've been tracking this culture. She got huge change in a 130,000-person organization. Okay? Think about culture not as values. Think about culture as a set of expectations about behaviors. So here are the General Motors values when Mary took over. Customers, relationships, excellence. Who's going to argue with that? Nobody. But if I'm a new GM employee, how should I behave? I haven't a clue. Okay? You've got to take values and take them into a set of expectations and drive them into behaviors. And once we do that, now we can manage culture. Okay? So here's why I think you ought to worry about culture. There's been actually some, persuasive research done on this. So the canonical study of culture was done by John Cotter at Harvard and Jim Heskett at Harvard a number of years ago. And they had a very simple hypothesis. They believed that strong culture companies would outcompete those without a strong culture. And they spent 4 or 5 years collecting data from 200 big US companies. And they analyzed, and they were looking at performance in terms of revenue growth and total shareholder return. They collected all this data, they analyzed the data, no relationship between strength of culture and performance. And they thought about it and they said, well, just because a culture's strong doesn't necessarily mean it's strategically aligned. And so they went back and they looked at the data, strong, strategically aligned. They found nothing. Then they thought about, well, many of these companies are in businesses that are changing rapidly. So they look at strong, strategically aligned cultures that could explore, that could adapt. And then they found very strong relationships. A few years ago, we replicated this with 60 high-tech companies. We found basically the same thing. That companies that had explore cultures that could adapt had higher revenue growth, had higher market-to-book ratings, had more analyst buy recommendations. Their stock were rated more higher and had higher employee Glassdoor ratings. We've recently done a study, we've expanded this, we've done a study of 450 US companies, we find the same thing. Companies with explore cultures are really poised to adjust to these disruptive changes that are shaping our industries. So, we've got to have a culture that's widely shared, strategically relevant, but it has to be able to adapt. So what would that look like? Well, it would be a culture that allowed some risk-taking. It would be a culture that valued innovation. It would be a culture that was willing to experiment, that would move relatively quickly. That's an explore culture. Think about the culture in most of your big, mature businesses. It's a culture really of making your numbers, of sort of being predictable, of sort of driving costs out. It's important, but it's completely different from the explore culture. So here are the 2 ways that leaders can develop explore cultures. And it depends on the circumstances. But one way is to think about it in terms of ambidextrous organizations. In our big mature businesses, we have an exploit culture. It's the right culture. We're going to sort of pay attention. You know, if you go in, for instance, Amazon is a company I admire. Maybe we'll get to hear a little bit about Amazon in a bit. If you go into an Amazon warehouse, it is all about driving costs out, efficiency. If you go into Lab 126, which is where they're doing their Alexa and their artificial intelligence, it's completely different, okay? The second way to do an explore culture is the way Microsoft has done it. That is to transform the entire organization. And so let me check my time here. Okay. So let me give you a sense for how Satya Nadella and Kathleen Hogan at Microsoft have changed their culture to an explore culture. And maybe Jason, when Jason on the panel can tell me I'm wrong or not on this. So here are the 5 levers that every organization that it doesn't matter whether it's in Japan or Germany or US, it doesn't matter. These are the same levers that all leaders use to drive culture and culture change. It's all based on the notion that what we're going to do is we're going to get very strong sets of information to people saying, this is how we need you to behave. That's the underlying psychology. So here are the 5 levers. In the first instance, it's how leaders behave. What they say and how they behave. Not just behave when they kick the culture change off, but when they behave over 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. The second lever is getting employees involved. Why is that important? Because when people are involved, we feel a sense of psychological ownership. So if you're going to get people involved, these are town halls, these are pulse checks, these are ambassadors, lots of surveys, lots of ways of getting employees involved. The third is making sure that your reward systems are lined up, but not money. It's a wrong way to change culture. Think about status, recognition, approval, promotion. The fourth lever is, do we have vivid illustrations about what the culture looks like? Can we hold people up and say, this is what the culture looks like? And the last lever is this notion of getting HR systems aligned. My experience with many HR systems is they run very professionally, but they are often not lined up with the culture. Okay, those are the 5 levers. Here's what happened at Microsoft. In 2013, late 2013, Steve Ballmer, the then CEO, announced that he was going to step down. At the time, 70% of Microsoft's revenues came from either their server products, their Office products, or their Windows products, and about 90% of their headcount was focused on those 3 businesses. Each of those businesses was under existential threat. That is, open source, Linux was threatening their server products. The sort of Office products were threatened by the move to tablets and the cloud, and their Windows products were threatened by mobility and tablets. Okay? In fact, in 2014, in January 2014, there was a Business Week article written, this is before Nadella was named CEO, there was a business article written that said, you don't want to be CEO of Microsoft. And one of the reasons was that the Microsoft culture was highly competitive, very political. You had to know the right answer. If you were challenged and you didn't have the right answer, you were in trouble. So it was a very, very individualistic, competitive culture. In February of 2014, Nadella is named CEO. Nadella is named CEO. And I think if you have followed Microsoft at all, you know that it has been a remarkable transformation. Reed Hastings, who was on their board, said this is the single transformation of a technology company that the best that he's ever witnessed. The first meeting that Nadella had with the senior team, he stood up and he made the following statement. He said, our ability to transform Microsoft, 130,000 people, our ability to transform Microsoft is our ability to change the culture. And what he did was he set as a kind of a rubric this notion of a growth mindset. We're going to go from an organization where you have to know it all to an organization where we're going to learn it all. And I think many of you know Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset versus fixed mindset. What Nadella wants to do is convert the entire organization into an organization that can be quick to opportunities, that can take risks, can do a kind of an explore culture. And here's what he did. It's really quite remarkable. He used these 5 levers. The first thing he did was he took 9 months and he listened to employees. He asked employees, he said, what is it that we have that we should keep? What do we need to honor and respect? And by the way, what do we have that's getting in our way? And he and Kathleen Hogan did an extensive data collection. They then had a meeting with his top 180 vice presidents, and they decided on what the culture was going to be, what the behaviors were going to be. He got employees involved in this through a whole variety of mechanisms, listening to them, town halls, constantly talking with them about it. They changed the reward system from a stack ranking system where the bottom 10% were always at danger of being let go to a much more collaborative. And they changed the metrics for this as well. And they began to talk and reward people who had a growth mindset. And then they began to hold up as examples people who illustrated this growth mindset. And you can ask, I'll ask Jason when we're on the panel, every senior management meeting, I'm told, begins with a story, an illustration of how somebody in the organization demonstrated a growth mindset. There is constant discussion about what a growth mindset looks like. And finally, they changed the HR system. They changed not just the performance management system, they changed how they recruit people, they changed how they train people. They trained 27,000 managers on how to talk about the culture, and they cascaded that into the organization. It's an absolutely remarkable change over the last 4 or 5 years. But not mysterious. They defined they understood what the strategy was, they defined the culture, and then they defined a set of behaviors, and then they drove those behaviors using these levers. You know, what Kathleen says, I think is right. There's no silver bullet. It's an integrated effort. It requires us, if we want to change to an explore mindset, it requires us as leaders to actually think about using these levers and being consistent. You know, Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric, you may like or not like, but he said something I think I agree with. He said, the reason most managers don't succeed at managing culture is because we get bored or distracted. Welch used to say, if you want to manage culture, you got to be 2 things as a leader. You got to be relentless, you got to be boring again and again and again. And that's what Nadella's doing. If you go on YouTube and Google any video of Satya Nadella, he is constantly talking about growth mindset and illustrating how growth mindset operates. Culture is not a set of slides. It's not a set of posters. It's a set of actions. And you can change culture. So that's what I think I've learned in the last 30 years about how you think about culture and how you manage culture. So thank you all very much.